All right. Good morning. Good afternoon, everybody. Give it just a minute here. We got other people joining. Thank you for joining us today. We are happy to share about the Bumblebee Conservation Benefit Agreement, which is a tool that we see as advancing both conservation and regulatory compliance. And so this is an effort that's been several years in the making, and we're happy to share it with you today as the agreement is currently out for public comment and review. So as we start off today, just want to introduce you briefly to the hosts of the webinar that we have. Also want to let you know um, some housekeeping items here at the end. But myself, Dan Salas, the director of our Sustainable Landscapes program here at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And I'm joined by a few other hosts today, which you'll be interacting with. We have Megan Petritis, who is our conservation program manager. So Megan's one who is administering, overseeing things like the Monarch CCA and this Bumblebee CBA. She'll be talking a little more about the purpose and the background and an overview of the agreement and its alignment also with the Monarch CCAA. Then we have Caroline Hernandez, our assistant director of the program, who is going to be joining us for the Q&A and also sharing ways that you can support the agreement as it is in the public comment period. And then we have Allison Little, who's our conservation program coordinator, and she's supporting on the technical support for the webinar today. So thankful for the help there. And then also we do have Catherine Bulliner from Fish and Wildlife Service, who will be joining us during the Q&A as well to answer questions you have there. So together we'll talk about this introduction to the agreement, what's included, and what you can expect with the agreement coming online. So just a couple of housekeeping things as we get started. First, everybody's muted upon entry, just to limit sort of background noise and distraction. So if you are having any technical difficulties, like if you can't hear us, well, you won't be able to hear this, but if you're having any issues, feel free to chat Allison Little directly via the chat, and she's happy there to help you troubleshoot. If you have questions, comments as we go through the webinar today, like I said, we're going to have a good amount of time set aside for Q&A, and so go ahead and submit those questions via that, and we'll cover those at that time. And then we are recording this presentation, and we do plan on sharing it afterwards. In case there's something that you missed or you want to go back and review, you have an opportunity to do that. We do post this as well as all our other webinars in the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group's resource library. So you will have access to that there. Okay, as we get started, I'm going to pass it over to Megan, who's going to share a little bit about the background and purpose of the CBA. So Megan, over to you.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I wanted to get us started with why an agreement like this is needed and how we got to this point that we are today with the agreement. So if you look at bumblebee populations over the past several decades, you'll see a lot of them are declining. In particular, 11 of the 21 native eastern bombus species have declines of around more than 50%. So certainly seeing huge declines, and those declines do have pretty big impacts to not only our food security, but also large economic impacts. So certainly something that we want to address. And if you look at the reasons for those declines, typically for bumblebees and pollinators, it's pathogens, climate change, small population size, pesticide exposures, but most notably habitat loss and habitat degradation is really driving a lot of these declines. It's estimated that 24 million acres of habitat, natural land covers, was lost between 2001 and 2017. So, how do we address this? And why is this needed? And why does industry need this? So why does the energy and transportation industry need this? So species listings, bumblebee species or otherwise, can result in a lot more project complexity and also increased time for those Fish and Wildlife Service consultations and state agency coordination. It can result in less flexibility for those projects and for the ability to maintain their land. There's also the compliance risks that's associated with species being listed. And as species listings change over time, that can add complexity to how do they address this, and those future changes are hard to really navigate as they happen. And then we've seen these sorts of hurdles result in some apprehension from the industry towards conservation overall. So a solution under the Endangered Species Act is the Section 10A1A permit. So this is an enhancement of survival permit. And it results in these different industries doing voluntary conservation work on their land. So it's a really nice uh, opportunity for both industry and Fish and Wildlife Service to come together in an agreement where they do voluntary conservation work on their land, and in return, they receive those regulatory assurances from Fish and Wildlife Service. So it helps streamline work on the Fish and Wildlife Service side, also helps provide that operational flexibility and regulatory certainty on the industry side, but also there's a benefit for those bee species because instead of waiting for a lot of them to get listed, we're doing habitat work now voluntarily and jump-starting that conservation work that needs to happen. You might be familiar with the Monarch CCAA. So this is another Section 10 agreement that we've been implementing for over the past 5 years. So that was an agreement that was approved in 2020. And to date, we've received 98 applications. And it's really great to see a lot of those applications go well above and beyond what is needed in order to stay in compliance with the program. So we currently have around 1.2 million acres of habitat committed to monarch recovery. So there's been a big impact from this program, and really we're looking to continue that work with the Bumblebee Agreement. Of the different conservation efforts that are recorded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Monarch TCA actually counts for nearly 10% of all those efforts. So we can really see what an agreement like this can contribute towards a species recovery. It's a pretty big impact for the Monarch TCA, and since organizations can still enroll, we anticipate that impact to only increase over time. So what is the Bumblebee CBA exactly? So this is an agreement that takes these different objectives as a starting point. So we started this effort by looking at what sort of conservation needs for listed average bumblebee species, how do we address those? Also making sure that whatever we put together aligns with the sorts of actions and things that are in control of industry and their ability to implement something. Also making sure that this is something that the program administrator, us at UIC, is something that we can administer and oversee. And also making sure that it's something that addresses what's under the Endangered Species Act and what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service needs for them to also sign off on something like this. So over the past 4 years, we've been taking input from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, different industry representatives, researchers, conservation organizations to get all these different inputs to put together the agreement itself. Like I mentioned, we've been over the past 4 years kind of in earnest putting together this to have that final outcome of more conservation in place for bumblebee species. So we're at the point in our development timeline where it's been under U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service review for several months now, and it is now posted to the Federal Register. But in terms of what the future looks like, after it gets posted to the Federal Register, it'll be open for 30 days under the public comment period. And then we will refine the agreement and have it open for enrollment. We're hoping within the next 3 to 4 months. So it is open for public comment. So we're really looking for your feedback on this, on how to improve it, and also your support. So it is a 30-day public comment period. So it opened January 23rd and it will end on February 23rd. So you have until then to submit different comments, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say on that. And I think now I'm turning it back over to Dan to dig a bit more into what's included in the agreement itself.
Great. Thank you, Megan. And thanks for giving that background and overview. It, like we said at the onset, right? Been a long time coming to put this together. And so, yeah, I want to share a little bit, an overview of the agreement, and then we'll get a little bit more into the specifics about participation and what those commitments look like. So the Bumblebee agreement, as Megan mentioned, is really focused on creating more conservation in more places, and then that trade-off of providing some regulatory relief as a result of those conservation commitments. So the primary goal of the agreement is to sustain and improve bumblebee foraging, nesting, and overwintering habitat. How that gets done is through a series of different objectives that we have written into the agreement itself. And so these different objectives address different aspects of bumblebee biology and conservation needs that address some of the primary reasons for their decline. So obviously, protecting, maintaining, and enhancing both nesting and overwintering habitat, as well as foraging habitat, are critical components. But we're also looking at ways that we can reduce and minimize exposures to stressors and impacts. Bumblebees are also a group of species that we're fairly information poor about. We really don't know much about particular individual species in a lot of places. And so if there's ways we can leverage more research and information gathering through this, we're trying to do that. And then also encouraging advanced conservation commitments. And so recognizing that there's other programs, other efforts that entities might be participating in for conservation. How do we sort of recognize that to encourage sort of this integrated conservation approach to sustain long-term investment in conservation? This agreement, I'll talk a little bit more about what those mean in terms of measures, but this agreement does include 11 different species as proposed. That includes several already listed endangered species listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. It includes proposed species as well as species that are under review right now that they've been petitioned. There's also several at-risk species, so ones that are in decline that may be expected to go into a petition or consideration at some point in the future. And so we wanted to include those to be more forward-thinking, to be more encompassing of species as well. The agreement also does include a procedure in place to further modify the agreement in the future should there be other species, bumblebees or other insects that align with those same conservation needs, that benefit from those same conservation actions, so we can continue to adapt the agreement over its duration so that we can, again, further some additional conservation commitments through this. The scope of this agreement is large. It involves the different ranges of these different bumblebee species that we see across the country. So depending on where you sit and what lands you manage, you might engage with only a single species on this or multiple species. When you combine those 11 species together, their combined ranges do basically cover the lower 48 contiguous states of the US, and that does overlap the geographic scale of the Monarch CCAA. And so again, we have some overlap in there, and that's something that you'll hear a lot more about. Megan's going to talk a little more about that we really worked hard to have overlap between this agreement and that Monarch CCAA, again, to sort of build on those existing commitments and also to make those administrative aspects easier. It goes back to those objectives that Megan shared. So to be eligible to enroll in this agreement, it's open for non-federal and federal entities that manage lands that are associated with energy and transportation uses. And so we say entities, right? That can be companies, that can be agencies, that can be organizations that manage those lands with energy and transportation use. And the primary eligibility aspect beyond that is just that there's authority and control to implement those conservation measures on those enrolled lands through the land rights. And so obviously, if there's fee-owned lands, those rights are there. But that also applies to things like easements and leases, where you have that management control and authority for those lands that you have. A common question is, which species apply in my area? And so we have those range maps, but To get a little bit more specific, we do have an online map available. If you go to the Bumblebee CBA website, you can access this interactive map and you can zoom into different parts of the country where it includes both the ranges for these 11 species, but then also these occurrence areas. So if you look at that little inset map, we've generalized occurrences from data from the bumblebees of North America that's been generously shared through Leif Richardson and the Xerces Society to provide more context for people, because oftentimes, people understand what a monarch butterfly is, but what is a Western bumblebee? What does a Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee look like? Are those near me? People might not know that as you know, inherently. So this is a tool that helps you to know what's around you in your area. We are also updating this map with a recent data update. So keep an eye out in the coming weeks. We'll have this updated with more information soon. So the requirements that are required through this, I mentioned these objectives on a previous slide. Each of those objectives has a series of conservation measures tied to them, which as an applicant or an enrollee is going through the process is committing to. So first, there is this first one, this maintaining, protecting, enhancing nesting and wintering habitat is a mandatory measure. So those requirements are a default for anybody enrolling in this. And that includes first maintaining what we call temporary set-aside lands, essentially areas that are intentionally not disturbed over the course of the year to make sure that we have um, undisturbed habitat present on the landscape. In addition to that, if a partner ever encounters a nest, an occupied nest of one of these target species, we want to make sure that those are protected. So there are some protective buffers in place for those when those are encountered. That's a very extremely rare circumstance for that to happen. And so when we do find those occurrences, we want to make sure we're being protective there and coordinating efforts on that front. Beyond that, applicants are required to select 3 of these 4 objectives and pick one conservation measure from each of those. And so this is really where this allows applicants to really tailor their conservation commitments to what their operations and abilities are. And so by addressing 3 objectives, we're addressing these broad needs of these species through the mechanisms that are within the ability and the control of the applicant. And so, the foraging habitat components, enhancements often rely on a lot of vegetation management tools that you may be familiar with, right? Targeted herbicide use, conservation mowing, using native seed mixes, those types of practices, maybe conservation grazing, prescribed burning, those types of things. Whereas reducing stressors might also involve things like targeted herbicide use, but we also want to do things like reducing conflicts with honeybee use, reducing the exposure of mowing itself. So areas that we have to mow for safety, for visuals, we can address that. The increasing knowledge is involving collecting data through things like the Atlas projects and funding and conducting research to inform bumblebee conservation in the future. And then those advanced commitments are including things that are programmatic in nature, that other commitments that might be being made, like having policies around invasive species prevention to support not spreading invasive species, or training personnel through habitat creation and species identification. How that looks on the ground in this kind of concept, right, depending on if you're a roadside or a pipeline or a transmission line, there's these sort of gradients of lands that you manage that are like the infrastructure itself in that gray, areas that you have active operations and maintenance, and then those, back slope or more, kind of border zone types of areas where you have periodic operations. And so these conservation measures are applied differently across those lands depending on, what the application is of that particular partner. Some measures, like if it's invasive species prevention or the nest avoidance, do apply to this entirety of the enrolled lands, depending on kind of where those actions are being undertaken. While others, like the set-aside commitments, like the active conservation measures, might apply in a more targeted fashion across that landscape. Again, based on where work is occurring, where those types of things are being tracked or set aside. In exchange for that, Megan mentioned there's that regulatory coverage and assurances. And so those do cover a wide range of operations, maintenance, and modernization activities. If you're familiar with the Monarch CCAA, it aligns with those types of covered activities that are included. But typically, if it's an operations maintenance or modernization refers to upgrading, rebuilding existing facilities. What's excluded is when we get into new construction. So if we're building something new that wasn't there before, in terms of being completely separate from existing lands, those are excluded just because of that size and scope typically of those projects. So when you think about how that's applied, we often get the question of, okay, well, there's this permit. How does it actually apply in a situation? Um, that depends on your perspective or your where you're coming from. So a non-federal entity, right? There is this enhancement of survival permit that you are having a certificate of inclusion to when you enroll in this program. That provides you that take coverage as it pertains to that, which is supported by this Section 7 consultation with the agreement, which has a biological opinion and incidental take statement. That permit also includes what's called a no surprises assurance, which is essentially knowing that there's no surprises, right? That you're not going to have any requirements changed on you over the course of enrollment. And so it provides that added layer of certainty and predictability for your operations and commitments. As a federal agency, because Section 7 allows you that coordination and working to avoid jeopardy of species, that permit doesn't necessarily apply to your activities, but you still have that Section 7 consultation and biological opinion to rely on to streamline your compliance obligations, as it were, with the service and the ESA. So that no surprises assurance doesn't apply because you still need to technically consult on that, but you do have essentially that work already done for you through the agreement and then showing those commitments in line with that biological opinion. And so to actually use that, when you get to those events that trigger that kind of coordination, that's where you can then work with the service to provide that documentation to make that connection between those covered activities within the agreement and those compliance documents. So we've had partners in the Monarch CCA already have to go through this because the Monarch as a proposed species has triggered that for federal obligations. And that's actually been a very quick, easy approach in many cases. And so I just want to leave you with the idea that this is this sort of like high level of certainty, right? There's different tools that can be used to address certainty as it relates to Endangered Species Act compliance. And so, everything from just doing avoidance minimization to, let's say, like a 4D rule. When you get into these Section 7 and then Section 10 tools like this, that does provide really robust certainty, which, again, what we've seen is that provides a lot of incentive to make those conservation commitments for the long term for these species, which is really a win-win for everybody, and that's what we're aiming for. Okay, so I'm going to dig a little bit more into the participation and enrollment, and I'm going to go quick because I do want to make sure we leave time for Q&A. Briefly, the enrollment steps do involve a series of different steps along the way. First, you do want to verify your eligibility. Again, those different items that we talked about previously, that you manage energy transportation lands and have that ability to manage and comply with the agreement. Then from there, I'd say you want to explore the enrollment. What does that look like? Looking at the commitments that are required, looking at the covered activities, and then more importantly, like who in your organization will help support that enrollment and moving to implementation. That's a really important piece that we've seen within companies and organizations considering this. From there, then preparing an application, which we have some very simple application requirements. And if you're already enrolled in the Monarch CCA, many of those align side by side with those needs. So you're essentially almost just updating your existing application, which makes that very, very easy to complete. Then that application is reviewed by UIC as well as the service to verify compliance. We, of course, follow up as needed to clarify requirements there. And then from there, you get ready for implementation. How do you take those actions that you're committing to in the application and actually get those done on the ground? One unique aspect, one difference from the Monarch CCA is the requirement to do a baseline assessment for the Bumblebee CBA. And that's used, that was historically also a part of safe harbor agreements. But the idea that we want to sort of capture a snapshot of the extent of known habitat for these species at the time of enrollment. Therefore, as those species hopefully expand and continue to expand on the landscape and occupy more habitat, that allows you essentially that gap in sort of acres above habitat committed so that you can return to baseline if you need to at some point in the future. And so we do in section 4 of the agreement describe a process for that. We've also worked to develop a tool to automate some of that analysis for you. If you're interested in looking at that, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today just for the sake of time, but we are working to make that an easy aspect of this application. And there are some resources in the toolkit that we share that provide more details on that. So once you've applied, once you're enrolled in the agreement, what does the annual implementation commitments look like? There's, of course, the conservation measures that you're committing to doing and implementing, those that are tracked and reported to us on an annual basis through the annual reporting of the agreement. There is then monitoring of habitat within enrolled lands. Essentially that monitoring is geared towards verifying that there is habitat where you're saying you're doing those conservation commitments. Of course, then you also need to comply with all federal, tribal, state laws that are associated with undertaking those activities. And then last but not least is supporting the program, essentially University of Illinois Chicago and this program that administers these through an administrative fee. So, and that fee helps support, work that we do in terms of coordinating with you, providing technical support, working with the service to continue to refine and adapt and improve the program, and to make sure that everybody's maintaining compliance through this. So a little bit more on some specifics there. For the tracking and reporting, again, you're tracking the conservation measures only on this that you're doing. So not necessarily the impacts, because the impacts are sort of already sort of addressed through the biological opinion. We've worked with the industry and work through the Monarch CCAA to kind of understand what the expected levels of impacts are and make sure that the conservation commitments are well exceeding, those sort of impacts that we would expect to see. So there is a required data format that the CBA requires that provided in. But what's good here is that this offers also flexibility. So we just want that tracking information in the format that's required for the CBA. On a day-to-day basis, you continue to use your existing tracking systems and databases and mapping tools, whatever you're using internally to track where and what actions are occurring and how much. And then you just roll up that information and provide that to us as part of that implementation. What you can see in this image here is a summary of the adopted acres, essentially, for the Monarch CCA. This is something we provide as part of our annual reporting that really shows, again, how that data gets used, illustrating where these actions are occurring and to what extent and where. And again, if you're already involved with the Monarch CCA, these requirements align sort of hand in glove with those already. Another place where there is really close alignment between those. Monitoring, very similar. If you're in the Monarch CCA, it's a very similar monitoring protocol. Some slightly different requirements in terms of the types of things that we're looking for. But again, you're doing randomly selected plots across lands that you enroll. You're doing this plot, which you see in this graphic in the upper right, essentially a 1,500 square foot plot area that is a brief meander transect, using a pollinator habitat scorecard to quickly evaluate, the habitat that's present at that location. And we want those samples conducted during peak bloom periods so that you're getting sort of the best snapshot of that habitat at the time that you're out there. What we have on the bottom here on the right, you can see this is a graphic showing sort of over 4 years of this type of monitoring in the Monarch CCA, how we've seen those monitoring commitments and actions grow over time. So you're seeing that geographic expanse of where monitoring is occurring. And that graph on the left is showing the number of plots sampled within the Monarch CCA over the past 5 years. And I just wanted to share those to illustrate the scale of the monitoring that is being conducted through that agreement, and knowing that we're trying to sort of replicate that here with the CBA. And so in terms of the requirements, we have in this graph on the right, the required plots based on the size of enrolled land that's being included. And so at first glance, it seems like it's very few plots given the size of area. But again, these are being done year after year after year, so they add on each other. And just like we showed in that last slide, those monitoring commitments do add and build over time to be something that's pretty impressive. At those plots, we're asking not just for the number of samples and the timing, but we want to know the percent cover of flowering plants that are present when surveyed, the number of different species that are flowering at those locations. We don't necessarily need to know the exact species, but there's the different number of species there. And then we do have a checklist for different nesting overwintering resources to verify that those are present in those locations. Above and beyond that, we're looking to get additional information on either native species and invasive species cover, actual observations that you're taking of bumblebees or other pollinators, and then other floral indicator species in terms of specific nectar pollen producing plants, high value nutrient plants, those types of things. And one thing we've done in this agreement, like we do in the Monarch CCA, is we do offer financial incentives for taking on some of those additional and optional commitments, whether it's additional conservation measures, whether it's taking on optional monitoring requirements, that does allow you and some incentives in the program. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Megan now, and Megan will talk a little bit more about that alignment. I've alluded to that several times, that alignment with the Monarch CCAA, but Megan will share a little bit more from here. So Megan, back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, to talk about the alignment, I first wanted to highlight some additional feedback we've heard from our enrolled partners that might be of interest. So yes, you get that regulatory assurances on specific activities, but we've also heard of some other feedback that our enrolled partners also have found additional ways that enrollment in the Monarch CCA um, has really helped in ways outside of just the regulatory side of things. So we've heard things like money being saved for compliance costs, or if they changed how they do mowing, seeing big savings that way. Also, just streamlining the NEPA compliance because they can point to their enrollment in this program as something positive they're already doing and already have in place. We've also heard that enrolled organizations really enjoy having these opportunities to build community and get to interact with their peers more as we provide those different opportunities to come to different meetings and to interact with people and see how other people are implementing the program. So lots of good things just outside of the regulatory side that we've heard from our partners. So again, with this alignment, so if you're an organization that is already enrolled in the agreement, the idea is that you just have to do a little bit more work to receive that coverage for the bumblebees. Things that are more bumblebee specific. There's a lot of overlap between monarchs and bumblebees, but also ensuring that we address certain things like nest avoidance and commercial bee avoidances that are more specific to bees. So on your land, if you are enrolled, you might already have some areas that you're considering habitat set-asides, and then some areas that you're doing more active conservation measures, such as targeted herbicide or timed mowing. And then once you enrolled in the CBA, there are specific requirements for those different set-asides and active conservation measures that you'll need to take into account as you find that alignment between the two programs on these lands. But then also including avoiding nest avoidance on the entirety of those enrolled lands should put you in compliance for the Bumblebee CBA. So really taking what you're already doing, all the good work you've already put into place, and adding a few more things to also ensure you're in compliance with what we've outlined in the Bumblebee CBA. So they are two different agreements, but there are a lot of areas of alignment. So there's different covered species, different things that you'll be monitoring. But the areas of alignment include a lot of similar conservation measures, the Section 7 consultation process. If you haven't yet applied to the Monarch Agreement, having a very similar application for both. Monitoring plots can be used for both. So if you're going out to monitor for the Monarch CCA, you can add a few more data points to also include monitoring for the CBA. And setting it up this way really encourages that continued conservation and additive commitments for both monarchs and bumblebees. reducing that regulatory confusion, and reducing paperwork, really trying to align these as much as possible and reducing the need for a project by project permit process, um, and then avoiding any disincentives to conservation. So really expanding what sorts of benefits you can get from enrollment in these two agreements, and encouraging to scale commitment efforts as easy and cost effectively as possible. So if you're already enrolled in one or both, or considering enrolling in both, there's a lot of areas for alignment. So it's not a whole other agreement that you're working to implement. Um, so now that we've kind of gone over all that, definitely want to hear from you. I've been seeing some questions come in through the Q&A section, and want to work to start to address those. So thank you all.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Megan. And to help us work through those questions, Caroline Hernandez is here and is going to help us talk through those. So I guess, yeah, keep putting questions that you have in the Q&A, and Caroline, maybe you can share some of those questions that we've gotten.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Megan. It was a really great presentation. We've gotten some questions in, and don't forget, we also have Catherine Bolliner from the service on this call too, and she can help answer those questions as well. Dan, I'm going to start with you. Finally, you have until February 23rd to submit a letter of support in the Federal Register. You have until February 23rd to tell other people to submit a letter of support to the Federal Register. We even have a template if you're a little tongue-tied to get that letter of support in. And then, we love talking about it. You can't get us to shut up about our conservation agreement. So come talk to us, give us constructive feedback, accolades, whatever you want. We will talk your ear off for days about these agreements. So there's lots of ways that you can support it. As I mentioned, we've got this toolkit. It's really neat. Megan just dropped the link into the to the toolkit into the chat, so that's where you can start poking around and finding those resources, those videos, webinars, and frequently asked questions. There's also another question about nests that we didn't get to, and so that's part of your answer right there. The Federal Register that was dropped into the chat earlier in the webinar, February 23rd. We would love you to submit a comment, a letter of support, and let's get this thing finalized. We're really excited about it, and we're really excited to have so much support from you all. Speaking of support, we would not have been able to do this without the partners that helped us write this agreement. So I think this is a really important slide, because you can make agreements until the cows come home, but they've got to be agreements that organizations will enroll in. So these are some of the organizations that helped write the agreement, ensuring that this is something that they would be willing to enroll in, and another organization could enroll in it without it just being some academia thing that we've done in a closed room. So also wanted to applaud all of these organizations and U.S. Fish and Wildlife for working together to create something so important and wide ranging. We had our technical partners as well that were giving us feedback and data and knowledge throughout this whole process. And so without them, we also would not have been able to make this something that I think is going to have such a wide-ranging impact. So want to thank and acknowledge those technical partners as well. As I promised, here is our contact information. We've got a LinkedIn page where we're also posting things that you can keep up to date. We've got a discussion board. We've got our toolkit. You can just run wild on our website and find hopefully everything that you would need to find, including our contact information if this is not enough. I did get one more question about